The report we are releasing today identifies and recommends fundamental reforms to IPCC's management structure. The IPCC needs to strengthen its procedures to handle ever larger and increasingly complex climate assessments, as well as the more intense public scrutiny coming from a world grappling with how best to respond to climate change. So today I'm pleased to present to you the chair and several members of our committee of experts who worked very hard during the summer and authored our report. They will give their findings and recommendations and will answer your questions. So joining me here are, first on my right, the committee's chair, Dr. Hal Shapiro, who is President Emeritus and Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Then Dr. Roseanne Diab, Executive Officer of the Academy of Science of South Africa. She was the committee's vice chair. And then finally, to my left, Sir Peter Williams, who is Treasurer and Vice President of the Royal Society in the United Kingdom, and who was a member of the InterAcademy's Council committee to review the IPCC. To begin, I will turn to Dr. Shapiro, who will present to you the main findings of the committee.
Robert, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Robert de Graaf, who's of course on my left, and Dr. Liu Young Zhang, co-chairs of the InterAcademy Council, for their leadership in organizing this review and arranging such a talented and dedicated committee, and it has been my pleasure to lead. I am especially grateful to the very distinguished members of this committee, as well as our extraordinarily talented staff, some of whom are here with us today, for sacrificing a good part of their summer schedules, not only to travel quite far for our meetings, but also to complete this report under such a tight deadline. As its name indicates, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or more succinctly, IPCC, sits at the intersection of science and policy, and in many ways it represents a very significant social innovation. Its massive, far-flung, and decentralized network of thousands of dedicated scientists who remain so committed to the assessment process is a significant achievement in its own right, as is the buy-in that has received from the almost 200 government representatives who participate in these assessments. Over the course of every 5 or 6 years, this group of scientists, split into 3 working groups, produces an exhaustive assessment of what is known about the physical scientific aspects of climate change, its global and regional impacts, and options for adaptation and mitigation. The government representatives perform key functions such as setting the scope of each assessment, electing the chair of IPCC, and the bureau that oversees the assessment process. And finally, by approving the language and the summaries for policymakers that accompany the reports of each of the working groups. Overall, in our judgment, IPCC's assessment process has been a success and served society well. The assessments have put IPCC on the world stage, raised public awareness of climate change, and driven policymakers to consider options for responding to climate change. Indeed, these were among the reasons IPCC was awarded a share of the Nobel Prize in 2007. All of this has been accompanied, however, by an increasingly intense debate in the media and public arena about climate change science and the costs of proposed climate policies, which in turn has met much greater public scrutiny of IPCC. Controversies have erupted over the perceived impartiality of IPCC towards climate policy, and all of you are aware of the attention given earlier this year in the press to the revelation of errors in the last assessment. Meanwhile, the assessments themselves have grown in size and complexity. Most of our key recommendations, which I'll talk about in a moment, are aimed at helping IPCC manage this increasingly complex process, and doing so under the gaze of a public microscope. To gain a fuller understanding of the complex IPCC assessment processes and the challenges IPCC faces as an organization, we not only solicited material from IPCC itself, but also from experts from many countries whom we interviewed, who had participated in the IPCC process, or who had publicly expressed criticism of the process, or who had a significant interest in the assessments themselves. We also distributed a questionnaire to hundreds of experts and other stakeholders with very different views of the IPCC, and placed the questionnaire on the web so that the general public could comment. In addition, we held 2 public meetings in Amsterdam at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, and in Montreal at McGill University, where we heard from IPCC and UN officials as well as scientists with quite varying views of the IPCC process. The committee drafted its report at a final meeting in Great Britain at the Kavli Royal Society International Centre in Chichley. Subsets of the committee also held meetings in Brazil, China, and the United States in an effort to obtain as diverse a set of views as we could. Before I get to our key recommendations, I would like to note what our charge was and how we approached our task. We were asked by the Secretary General and the IPCC Chair to focus, as Robert has already said, on the processes and procedures of IPCC, and to make recommendations aimed at strengthening the process by which future climate assessments are managed and prepared. We were not asked to re-referee the last IPCC assessment or to review the basic science of human-caused climate change. We recommend some significant reforms in the management structure that we believe will strengthen the day-to-day management and decision-making capability, while at the same time maintaining oversight, transparency, and a variety of perspectives. There are a number of recommendations in the report, and I urge you to read it in its entirety. It's not a long report. You can see it here. This is the report. Really, to understand what we have done, I really encourage you to read as much as you are able in that area. But let me highlight a few of our recommendations here this morning. First, we recommend that the panel, which is, of course, the governments who have organized IPCC, should elect a small executive committee to act on its behalf in order to maintain a year-round ongoing decision-making capability. The committee should include members from outside IPCC or even outside of the climate science community in order to give it more credibility and independence. In addition to this executive committee, we recommend that an executive director with the status of a senior scientist, equal to that of the working group co-chairs, and with more autonomy and responsibility than the position of the current secretary, should be appointed to lead the secretariat. A full-time chief executive, this executive director, serving alongside a part-time chair as a model of leadership employed at other organizations that we think would work well with IPCC. Because the executive director would report to the chair and speak on behalf of IPCC, it should be someone in whom the chair can place high confidence. Importantly, to bring a fresh approach to each assessment, we also recommend that the IPCC chair, the proposed executive director, the working group co-chairs, all be limited to a term of one assessment. These are 8 people, of course. These are the leaders of each assessment, and we think that the term of one assessment is appropriate for all of those leadership positions. This recommendation is not in any way motivated by an evaluation of the current leadership of IPCC. Such an evaluation was beyond our charge. Rather, this recommendation has to do, as I said, with ensuring a variety of perspectives on the top, as well as maintaining the overall vitality of the assessment process. Another of our recommendations is that a rigorous conflict of interest policy be developed and applied to senior IPC's leadership and all authors, review editors, and staff responsible for report content. It was beyond our charge to review the conflict of interest controversies that have been reported in the press. But we did note that the lack of a conflict of interest policy was troubling to many stakeholders we heard from, and that many government and non-government institutions that conduct assessments or provide scientific advice have adopted such policies to ensure the integrity of and public confidence in their results. As you know, the request for our review was prompted in part by a few errors discovered in the last assessment. And as part of our charge was to look at the review process and guidelines for assuring the quality of data used. We concluded that the IPCC review process is thorough, but that stronger enforcement of existing IPCC review procedures could minimize the number of errors. This can be accomplished in part by encouraging review editors to fully exercise their existing authority to ensure that all review comments are adequately considered. At the same time, we made some recommendations for streamlining the review process to somewhat ease the burden on authors given the sheer number of reviews. There were 90,000 review comments on the last draft assessment, for example. As you also know, the use of non-peer-reviewed science or sources, which is sometimes called gray literature, has also been controversial and blamed for some of the errors. However, we found that such material, which can include technical reports, conference proceedings, observational data, or model results, often is relevant and appropriate for inclusion in the IPC assessment process. IPCC has guidelines for the use of such sources, but these guidelines are vague and have not always been followed. We recommend that these guidelines be made more specific, including noting what types of sources are unacceptable, and that they be more strictly enforced to ensure that unpublished or non-peer-reviewed literature is adequately evaluated and appropriately flagged in the reports wherever it is used. We were also asked to examine how the full range of scientific reviews is handled. Though all reasonable points of view need to be considered in the assessment process, they do not all need to be given equal weight, and what to include is, at the end of the day, a matter of professional judgment. At the same time, authors need to be careful of what is known as confirmation bias, where too much weight is placed on their own views relevant to others. Our report recommends that lead authors document the full range of thoughtful scientific viewpoints that has been considered, and that coordinating lead authors and review editors satisfy themselves that due consideration was given to alternative views that were properly documented. The characterization of uncertainty is also important. Again, IPCC's guidelines in this area have not been consistently followed. The Working Group 2 report, for example, contains many statements that were assigned high confidence, but for which there is little evidence. In future assessments, all working groups should characterize uncertainty in a consistent manner, qualifying their level of understanding of a topic based on the amount of evidence and the level of agreement amongst experts, and quantifying the likelihood of an event occurring by using a probability scale, but only when there is sufficient evidence to actually do so. There is general agreement amongst people we talked to who responded to our questionnaire, as well as an acknowledgement by the IPCC itself that its public response to the errors earlier this year was slow and inadequate. We understand a new communications officer is developing a communication strategy, which we urge be completed and implemented as soon as possible. The strategy should include a plan for rapid but thoughtful responses to crises and guidelines on how to speak on IPCC's behalf while staying within the bounds of IPCC reports. The strategy also needs to emphasize transparency. In fact, given the intense public scrutiny, we believe that a commitment to transparency across IPCC is absolutely necessary. The assessment process is difficult to understand, even for those involved in it, and we feel that IPCC needs to be as transparent as possible if confidence in the process is to be maintained. I have two concluding observations. First, the committee believes that most of its recommendations can be implemented during the fifth assessment and should therefore be seriously considered during the upcoming plenary in Korea. Second, although we believe our recommendations will strengthen the assessment process, we also understand that in the end, the quality of the results depends on the quality of the leaders at all levels who guide the assessment process. It is only by continuing to engage the energy and expertise of a large cadre of distinguished scholars, as well as the thoughtful participation of government representatives, that high standards are maintained and that truly authoritative assessments continue to be produced. IPCC deserves, in our judgment, credit for adapting to lessons learned in past assessments, and we hope that it will remain flexible and creative in moving forward. In summary, I would say that IPCC has been successful overall, but fundamental changes are necessary to ensure its continuing success. Thank you very much. We'll be glad to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, I'll open the floor for questions. Please state your affiliation. Yes.
Did your review take into account any criticisms of the computer models that were used, for example, models that failed to predict the global decline in temperatures over the last decade, and also in the assessment of confidence levels?
I noted in the last report that there was an acknowledgement of low scientific understanding of the effects of solar, I think the radiation events, related natural phenomena. Is that part of your recommendation to provide a further discussion either of areas where there's low scientific understanding, because it was dealt with very briefly?
Sorry, excuse me for interrupting. First of all, the second part of your question. We have a chapter in the report that deals with uncertainty and how it ought to be handled. And so we spent quite some time thinking about that and when it is appropriate to say you have high confidence in something and when it is inappropriate to say that. And you can find that in Chapter 3 of our report. And I referred in my comments to some specific examples that we took out from Working Group 2 in this case. There are pages 35 and 36 in the report. And that might help you, help any of you who are interested in just how we feel about that. That's a very important question. With respect to models, we did not redo the science. We were not reassessing the science of this fourth assessment. But it is true, and it's noted in a few places in the report, that there are issues with respect to these models regarding how we understand the parameters and how you can independently assess the parameters that govern these models. That's an ongoing problem for science in this area. But we did not do a careful, thoughtful assessment of the models themselves.
Yes.
From Al Jazeera English. I know you didn't review the science here. However, by saying that there were certain statements that were given a high degree of confidence without evidence, people are going to interpret that as calling the science into question. Can you put it in perspective? What kind of examples?
I can give you some examples, and I pointed to the pages in the report where it actually occurs. And I should say the examples we have come from the Summary for Policymakers, right? And it's something which we've looked at very carefully in this respect. We looked less carefully at all the statements that are made in all these working group reports. As you know, this is a massive report, and the time we had, we couldn't go through every statement in the report, but we could do that in the Summary for Policymakers. And so we found in the Summary for Policymakers that there were two kinds of errors that came up. And we give some examples. You can find more examples. I'll just try to characterize them for you. One is the kind where you place high confidence in something for which there is very little evidence. And we've located a number of those. And the other is the kind where you make a statement in which you have high confidence, but as it say rather technically, you can't falsify the statement. So if you say it's going to, just take an extreme, you look at the example on page 36, but take an extreme. If you say it's going to rain in New York next year, that's not much of a statement, right? If you say, so there were statements like that where they played high confidence in statements that really had no substantive value in our judgment. And this is primarily from the Summary for Policymakers. I want to emphasize that. And not from the working group reports themselves.
Yes.
Could you look into the Himalayan example specifically to see how that got in there and what were your conclusions on that? And on the conflict of interest, I mean, obviously scientists live in the real world and they're going to come to certain conclusions about how they feel about climate change. How are you going to police that kind of work and ask them to be sort of...
First of all, again, two questions. On the Himalayan example, that is laid out in detail in the report, and at least in our judgment, it came from just not paying close enough attention to what the reviewers said about that example. They just didn't follow through carefully enough on what review editors had commented. There were a number of reviewers that pointed out that this didn't seem quite right to them, and that just was not followed through. I think it may be, here I'm speculating now, I think it may have been because at that time they were just overwhelmed by the number of comments and didn't take them all quite as seriously as they should be. That's just my inference. I'm not sure about that. But if you're interested, it is laid out specifically in the report, and the report also indicates what the reviewer said and what the response was or wasn't. So there's details of that in the report, but I don't remember the page number. What is it?
Page 23.
Page 23, okay. On the conflict of interest, it is true that everybody in some broad sense has a conflict of interest, right, because of opinions and so on. The main issue is not whether people have biases, that they have opinions, but that they should be revealed and open for all to understand. That's really the main issue here. It's not that nobody with it, I mean, if you had to choose people only who had no preconceived ideas, whatever, it would be very hard to find them. But you just want to be able to have a record of what their issues are so that it is clear to everybody just what the situation is. So, for example, when we met as a committee, the very first time we met in Amsterdam, we went around the table and all of us sort of laid out what our views were, what our past was, how we may have various kinds of preconceived notions here so that each of us could understand where we were coming from and make allowance. It's more of that kind of thing. And administering it is tough, but it's not impossible. Many scientific organizations do this. The National Research Council here, I believe the Royal Society, and I'm sure in the Netherlands it's the same. And so it's, as I said in my remarks, most governments and other people who do these assessments have such things in place. Incidentally, as does UNEP and WMO. UNEP and WMO, as we point out, do have them, but they don't seem to apply to IPCC for some reason.
These revelations sort of about the Himalaya, etc., came out, sorry, I don't have time with this. Came out at the same time, to a certain extent, that the emails were released. So was there any sense that it got into the report because they wanted to make sort of a sensational point and sort of draw attention to something? And second of all, it did dent the sort of credibility of the process. And do you think what you're recommending would reverse it?
I think the errors made did dent the credibility of the process. There's no question about it. And trust is something you have to earn every year. You never build up trust. You just have trust. You have to re-earn it all the time. And there's no question that IPCC's the trust in what they have to say was somewhat dented by all these controversies. We think that what we have recommended will help. Not all by itself, will help restore some of this. I've forgotten what the first question was, I'm sorry.
Just putting that in there, the Himalayan example, that was sort of sensational, I guess.
You mean that we put it in?
No,
they put it
in.
I have no evidence one way or another on that.
Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. Professor Shapiro, given that you say that there should be one assessment for an IPCC chair starting now, does that mean that the current IPCC chair, Mr. Pachuri, should be replaced, and how soon?
Well, let me try to repeat what I said. We said, well, our notion was that an organization like this needs to have its leadership constantly changed, and so to increase the vitality here. And we were not at all focused on the IPCC chair in making that recommendation. We made it for the 8 senior people in the organization, and not for the chair, particularly for the chair. So in making this recommendation, it was not motivated by or in any way connected to Dr. Pachuri or any other leader in IPCC. So this was just a recommendation for the process as a whole and not related to any particular individual. We did not, just to repeat myself, we did not evaluate or attempt to evaluate the quality of anyone in the IPCC leadership.
So does that mean that any changes would have to wait until this recommendation was adopted?
I think that issue is up for the IPCC plenary. The government's involved to decide how they want to deal with it, what it means to them. That's something I couldn't speculate on. I've not talked to you.
And yet it's the logic of your recommendation that the fit assessment should be carried out under a new chair. That's a logical extension of your recommendation.
That's one possible logical response to it. There are other logical responses.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I wanted to ask also about conflict of interest. I'm looking in Chapter 4. First, I mean, with Mr. Pachuri, there was a lot of controversy around his income. Not he was receiving, but his foundation that he works for in India was receiving from banks and for-profit energy companies. And I see that you're saying they should have a policy, but it also says that there seems to be these references to like confidential disclosure forums, confidential discussions. And I just wonder if you think, given the scrutiny and the controversy around, first of all, should the chair be a part-time position? Should they have outside connections to businesses? And if so, why should this be confidential? At the UN, Ban Ki-moon has said that there should be public disclosure of financial interests of officials. So I guess, did you think that's true? And do you think that this, how is it consistent, this idea of openness and transparency with the proposal for sort of a confidential review of financial conflicts of interest?
Well, my colleagues may want to also comment on this. We have not laid out in the report any details just how they should be administered. We think you raised some very important questions there. I think those are very important. And just how they should be administered, exactly who should administer it, and who should make the decisions on whether the conflict should exclude someone from participation are very important questions, but would have to resolve once we decide who's going to deal with this. Now, for example, I think we thought that